This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, businesses, and locations are entirely invented, and any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. I am his wife. 11 years. Claire Whitmore said it into a microphone in front of 46 strangers holding champagne flutes, and the band behind her stopped playing mid-bar. 11 years. Nobody in that botanical garden moved. Not the caterer holding a tray of crab cakes halfway to a table. Not the photographer, finger frozen on the shutter button. Not Daniel, the man she'd married at 20, who stood 6 feet away in a navy suit he'd bought for someone else's future. To understand how a wedding planner ends up holding a microphone at her own husband's engagement party, you have to go back 19 days. Back to a Tuesday morning, a cup of coffee, and a phone that buzzed twice. If you're new here, this is where I tell true-to-life stories about the quiet wars people fight before anyone else finds out. The ones where the strongest move in the room isn't the loudest one. Stick around to the end, because before this story is over, I want to know what you would have done in Claire's shoes. Let's go back to that Tuesday. Heron Creek, South Carolina, is the kind of town where everyone knows the name of your dog before they know your last name. At 7:42 a.m., on a Tuesday in March, Claire Whitmore was already 3 coffees deep, standing in the office of Magnolia and Vine Events, with a binder open to a wedding 14 weeks out. She was 31 years old, and for 8 years, Knightley had built this company from a card table in her apartment into the most requested event planning service on the South Carolina coast. The most requested. 311 weddings, 42 corporate galas. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Claire, I'm back. Can we meet today? I have news. The second message arrived 11 seconds later. A photo of a boarding pass. Lisbon to Charlotte. Flight 62 Sun, seat 14C, and 3 heart emojis. Claire smiled before she'd even finished reading it. Renee Ashford. Her roommate from freshman year at Coastal Carolina. The woman who had once talked her out dropping a marketing class by reciting, word for word, the entire plot of a movie neither of them had actually seen, just to make her laugh. 8 years ago, Renee had taken a junior design fellowship in Lisbon and never quite come home. They had gone from video calls every Sunday to once a month, to a string of unanswered, "we should catch up soon," texts that both of them privately understood as failures of effort, not affection. Some friendships don't end, they just go quiet. Claire cleared her 11 a.m. and met Renee at the Cobalt Café on Driftwood Lane, a narrow shop with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed in 6 years. Renee looked different, her hair longer, a sharper coat, a confidence in her shoulders that hadn't been there at 22. But the laugh was exactly the same, loud enough that the barista glanced over. They hugged for what felt like a full minute. 8 years, Claire said, holding Renee at arm's length to look at her properly. You look like you robbed a French film. I feel like I robbed a French film, Renee said, and they both laughed, and for a few minutes it was 2018 again. 2 girls splitting a muffin they couldn't afford. Then Renee set down her coffee, and her whole face changed. That specific brightness people get right before they hand you the best news of their life. Claire. I found him. The one. He proposed 3 weeks ago on Driftwood Marina, right at sunset. The one. She held up her left hand. A round-cut diamond caught the cafe's overhead light and threw it back in small, white sparks. We're doing the engagement party next month. And I need you to plan it. Of course I will, Claire said, and meant it completely. The way she meant it for every couple who walked into her office starry-eyed and slightly disorganized. Tell me everything. What's he like? What does he do? He's an architect, Daniel. Renee was already pulling out her phone, scrolling. We met when his firm did the renovation on the design studio I was consulting for downtown. Claire. He's exactly what I always said I wanted and never thought I'd actually find. He told me on our second date that most people in this town were never going to build anything that outlasted them, and he didn't plan on being one of them. Renee laughed, like it was charming. Claire had heard a version of that exact sentence at her own dinner table more than once, usually right after dismissing something she'd built. She turned the phone around. The photograph showed a man on a dock at golden hour, one arm around Renee's waist, the other hand holding a glass of red wine. He was wearing a pale blue linen shirt, the kind sold in exactly one shop on Magnolia Street, a shop where Claire had bought that exact shirt for her own husband 2 Christmases ago, because the salesgirl had said the color would bring Tata's eyes. On his left wrist, a brass-faced watch with a worn leather band. Claire had given him that watch. Engraved on the back, though no camera could have caught it from this angle, were 4 words she had purchased herself at a jeweler's counter in Charleston. Build something that lasts. He's handsome, Claire said. Her voice came out steady. She would think about that later. How steady it came out, like a stranger had borrowed her mouth. What's his last name? Whitmore, Renee said, beaming. Daniel Whitmore. Claire's own last names, spoken back to her across a café table by the happiest person she knew, landed like a stone dropped into very still water. She did not gasp. She did not knock over her coffee. 8 years of standing in front of nervous brides, calming caterers who'd shown up 2 hours late, smoothing over a flower girl's tantrum 30 seconds before the processional. 8 years of holding the room together, no matter what hit was happening inside her. And every one of those years showed up right now as the only reason her hands did not shake. Daniel Whitmore. She repeated it, like she was simply confirming a guest list. That's a good name for a wedding invitation. Renee laughed, delighted, completely unaware that she had just handed her oldest friend the worst piece of news of her adult life over a $5 muffin. 2 days later, on March 6th, Renee stopped by the Magnolia and Vine office for the first time, carrying a tray of cinnamon rolls for old time's sake, and spent 40 minutes turning over fabric swatches and peony varieties like the 8 years apart had simply folded shut. I keep thinking about how lucky I am, Renee said, holding a swatch of ivory linen up to the window light. Coming home, finding him, finding you again, all in the same year. Claire smiled and said the kind of true professional sentence that had quietly become her only language for get through the day. Let's make sure this party looks like exactly how happy you feel. Claire did not go home that night and confront anyone. She drove the long way along Tidewater Boulevard, past the marsh grass turning gold in the last light, and she made a decision that would define the next 19 days. She would not react. She would find out. Not because she's doubted what she'd seen, the shirt, the watch, the engraving she alone knew existed, but because in 8 years of business, Claire Whitmore had learned exactly one unbreakable rule. You do not confront a problem until you know its full size. A bride who panics over one loose thread can unravel an entire dress. A wife who panics over one photograph can lose everything she has a legal right to keep. Daniel came home at 9:50 p.m., loosening his tie, smelling faintly of restaurant garlic and an aftershave that wasn't the one she'd bought him for his birthday. Sorry, babe. Client dinner ran long. Mercer account, the waterfront project. He kissed her forehead on the way to the kitchen. The same way he had nearly 4,000 times before. The same way. That was the part that frightened her most. Not that he could lie, but that he could lie. And still kiss her exactly the same. You wouldn't believe the numbers on this deal, he added, pouring himself a glass of water, not really talking to her so much as past her. It's a different league than centerpieces and seating charts, Claire. Real money. He had said some version of that sentence at least once a month for years, and she had always let it go. Tonight, for the first time, she heard exactly how much it had been costing her to let it go. Over the next 4 days, working quietly after Daniel had gone to sleep, Claire built a folder on her laptop labeled Magnolia Vendor Contracts. Do not delete. A name boring enough that no one would ever open it by accident. Inside, she began logging dates. She cross-referenced 11 months of Daniel's late nights at the firm against Renee's public social media check-ins. Going back to the week Renee had first mentioned, months ago, a vague downtown renovation client in one of their increasingly rare catch-up texts. 6 of those nights matched within the same evening. 2 matched to the exact hour. On March 8th, Monica Reyes, Claire's senior coordinator at Magnolia and Vine, a woman who had worked beside her for 6 years and could read her moods the way she read seating charts, stopped by Claire's desk with 2 coffees and a comment she clearly thought was harmless. "Random thing," Monica said, setting one cup down. "I was scouting the private room at the Tidewater Grill for the Bellamy wedding Tuesday night, and I swear I saw Daniel in there. With some woman. Didn't want to say anything if it was a client thing. She said it the way you'd mention running into someone at the grocery store." Claire thanked her, said it was probably a permit meeting, and waited until Monica had walked away before she let her hand stop holding the coffee cup quite so carefully. Tuesday, March 7th. The same night Daniel had told her he was reviewing structural drawings until 10. Then she opened the joint checking account she and Daniel had shared since their 2nd year of marriage. An account she rarely scrutinized closely because Daniel had always handled the boring financial stuff. A phrase she now turned over in her mind like a coin with a second, uglier side. She found a recurring transfer once a month for the past 14 months, 1,890 on average. Memo line reading Coastal Vista Holdings, Consulting. 14 months. She did not recognize the name. She would, very soon, come to know it intimately. The Cobalt Café became, without either of them planning it, the place where Claire's 2 realities collided. Every few days, Renee chattering about venues and flower counts, while Claire gave her professional advice on the wedding she was simultaneously building a legal case around. The Heron Creek Botanical Gardens in late April, Claire told her, flipping through a vendor catalog. String lights through the live oaks, 46 guests, maybe 50. It photographs like something out of a postcard. "You're the best person I know," Renee said, squeezing her hand across the table, and Claire did not pull her hand away, because some part of her, the part still standing in for the friendship they used to have, genuinely wanted this party to be beautiful, even now, even knowing what she knew. On March 11th, at 6:03 p.m., Claire watched from her car outside Whitmore Architectural Group as Renee climbed into the passenger seat of Daniel's gray pickup truck on Magnolia Street, laughing at something he'd said. She had not planned to follow him. She had planned that evening to drop off a signed contract at his office before it closed. Instead, she sat half a block away with the engine off for 11 minutes, watching her husband lean across the console to kiss a woman who, 3 weeks earlier, had been crying happy tears into Claire's shoulder over a muffin. On March 12th, Claire stopped into Coastal Thread, the menswear shop on Magnolia Street, where she'd bought Daniel that pale blue linen shirt 2 Christmases earlier, to pick up a gift for a groom in one of her weddings. Wanda Pruitt, who had run the register there for 19 years and remembered every regular customer's collar size, greeted her warmly. "Tell Daniel that necklace went over well, I hope," Wanda said, folding a sweater. "He came in last Thursday all nervous, wanted something his fiancée would love. I told him the gold pendant, not the silver." Fiancée. Wanda kept talking, pleasant and oblivious, while Claire stood very still at the counter, holding a gift box she could no longer remember selecting. She thanked Wanda, paid for the groom's gift, and walked back to her car before she let her face do anything at all. "Quick question before we keep going. If a stranger behind a register casually confirmed your husband's affair while ringing up your gift card, would you have said something right there? Or walked out exactly like Claire did? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know." Now, back to Heron Creek. 2 days later, Renee called, breathless, while Claire was driving home. "Claire, you won't believe it. Daniel took me to look at a unit at the Tidewater Residences, the one on the 9th floor with the wraparound balcony. He put down the deposit yesterday. $87,400, can you believe that?" he said. A man should build the home before he asks the woman to fill it. Claire pulled into her own driveway, parked and sat in the dark for a long moment before going inside. $87,400. She knew, with the specific sickening clarity of someone doing arithmetic, she didn't want to finish. Exactly which account that number had likely come from. Because 3 nights earlier, she had quietly logged into the firm's joint business portal using Daniel's saved password, the one he'd set up years ago, so she could pay contractors during her own busy season, and found a withdrawal from their shared retirement fund in almost the exact amount. On the morning of March 15th, sorting laundry, Claire found a business card folded into a suit jacket pocket. Cream stock, raised black lettering, Coastal Vista Holdings. Daniel R. Whitmore, managing member. No phone number, no address. Just a name she now recognized from a bank memo line, printed onto something a person carries to hand to someone else, in person, like a real company. She photographed both sides and slid it back exactly where she'd found it. On the evening of March 16th, Claire drove to the office of Susan Kessler, Esquire, a family law attorney whose name she had heard exactly once before, at a wedding she'd planned for one of Susan's paralegals. Susan's office smelled like old books and stronger coffee than the Cobalt Café served. She listened to Claire's entire account without interrupting once, taking notes in handwriting so neat it looked typed. "Walk me through the dollar figures again," Susan said when Claire finished. "Slowly. I want every number you have." Claire read from her notes. 14 monthly transfers to an entity called Coastal Vista Holdings, averaging $1,890, totaling $26,460. A withdrawal of $87,400 from their joint retirement account for a condominium deposit at the Tidewater Residences, processed through Cobblestone Title and Escrow 9 days earlier. And, discovered only that morning when Claire finally worked up the nerve to dig through Daniel's home office drawer, a printed business filing. Articles of organization for Whitmore and Ashford Architecture, LLC, registered with the South Carolina Secretary of State on February 2nd, listing Daniel Whitmore as managing member and Renee Ashford as a 22% equity partner, with $124,000 in initial capital contribution. $124,000. Susan set down her pen. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be very direct with you. Under South Carolina law, what you're describing isn't simply infidelity. That's heartbreak, but it's not actionable on its own. What you're describing is the dissipation of marital assets to fund an extramarital relationship and a separate business venture without your knowledge or consent. That changes everything about how a court will divide what's left. Before you do anything else, before you say one word to your husband, I need 3 things. Bank statements, the LLC filing, and a notarized timeline. No emotion in the live file, just dates and dollars. Courts don't rule on heartbreak. They rule on evidence." Susan picked up her phone and texted someone before Claire had even stood up. "I'm bringing in a forensic accountant I've used on 11 cases like this one. He'll trace every dollar from Coastal Vista Holdings back to its source and build a report a judge can't argue with." "There's something else," Claire said quietly. "Rennie, Daniel's fiancée, she's asked my company to plan their engagement party. She has no idea who I am to him." Susan studied her for a moment. "Then you're either going to walk away from that contract today," she said, "or you're going to use it. There isn't a middle option that protects you." "I'm not walking away from anything I built," Claire said. "Not my company, not this marriage assets, not the truth." What followed was 11 days that Claire would later describe, to no one but Susan, as the hardest professional performance of her career. She kept every vendor meeting with Renee. She approved the floral order, white peonies and trailing jasmine, $1,240, and the catering menu, and the string quartet for cocktail hour. She sat across from her husband's mistress 3 more times and discussed seating charts with the calm, generous attention she gave every client. Because the alternative, letting any crack show before the evidence was complete, Would have cost her everything Susan was helping her protect. Trained calm. It was not that she felt nothing. It was that she had spent 8 years learning exactly how to keep functioning while feeling everything at once. And she used every hour of that training now. At home, Daniel noticed nothing. He still came home late 3 nights a week, still kissed her forehead on his way to the refrigerator, still asked how her day was. On the night of March 22nd, he set his phone face down on the kitchen counter while he showered, and it lit up with a single line of text Claire could read from across the room. "Can't wait for Saturday. You'll be the most beautiful thing in that garden." She did not pick up the phone. She did not need to. She simply finished drying the dish in her hand and put it away. Over dinner that same week, Daniel mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd told a client her business was basically a hobby that turned into a side income, and laughed when Claire didn't. "I'm kidding mostly," he said, already reaching for the remote. She did not laugh either. She filed the comment away in the same place she was filing everything else now. Not as a wound, but as evidence of exactly how he had always ranked her. On March 24th, 3 days before the party, Claire received a call she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Patricia Loomis. I'm the bookkeeper over at your husband's firm." Claire had met Patricia exactly twice, at firm holiday parties. A quiet woman in her 50s who'd kept the books at Whitmore Architectural Group for 11 years. "I probably shouldn't be calling you," Patricia said. "And if you tell me to hang up, I will. But I've been entering invoices for 14 months from a vendor called Coastal Vista Holdings that doesn't appear in any state business registry I can find. And I've been told twice not to ask questions about it. I have copies. I'd like to give them to someone who'll actually do something with them." For 14 months, Patricia Loomis had typed the numbers, balanced the books, and said nothing. Not out of approval, but out of fear of losing a job that, at 53, with a mortgage and a daughter in nursing school, she could not afford to lose. It was not Claire's forensic instinct and not Susan's legal precision that finally completed the file. It was the quiet woman, 2 floors down, who had simply run out of room to look the other way. Claire met Patricia at the Cobalt Café an hour later. The folder Patricia handed across the table contained 14 invoices, each one for designs consulting services, each one routed to an account at a bank in Wilmington, North Carolina. None of them attached to any actual consulting work Patricia had ever seen performed. Susan reviewed them that evening and called Claire at 9:12 p.m. "This is everything," Susan said. "This is enough." On the afternoon of March 24th, Claire drove to the Tidewater residences herself, parked across the street, and watched through the glass-walled sales office. As a broker in a blazer walked Daniel and Renee through a scale model of the building, pointing toward a small marked unit on the 9th floor. Renee leaned into Daniel's shoulder, laughing at something, while Daniel rested a hand at the small of her back. The exact gesture, Claire realized with a strange, distant clarity, he had used on her for 11 years, like a tool he simply moved between projects. She did not go inside. She photographed the 3 of them through the glass, time-stamped 3:51 p.m., and sent the image to Susan's office before she had even started her car. That night, lying beside Daniel in the dark, Claire found herself running through every year she had spent making room for his ambitions. She had turned down a chance to open a second Magnolia and Vine location in Savannah. 4 years earlier, the same spring he'd needed her steady income while his firm found its footing. She had loaned the business $14,000 of her own savings before they'd ever merged their accounts. Money he'd promised to repay within a year, and never had. She had rescheduled her own busiest wedding weekend twice, so she could quiz him on building codes before his licensing exam. None of it had ever been a flashback in her mind. It was simply the ground she'd been standing on. 3 nights before the party, Daniel rolled over and murmured, half asleep. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Just busy with a client's wedding," Claire said, and felt, for the first time in 19 days, the full weight of how easily a true sentence could still function as a complete lie. The morning of the party, Claire finally told Monica the truth, sitting in the Magnolia and Vine office, with the door closed and 2 cold cups of coffee between them. Monica listened without a single interruption, the same way she'd once listened to brides describe wedding day disasters. And when Claire finished, she simply asked, "What do you need from me tonight? Not are you sure? Not are you okay? Just what do you need?" "Run the room exactly like always," Claire said, "until I tell you otherwise." Monica nodded once, the way she did when a vendor was running late, and there was nothing left to do but trust the plan already in motion. The engagement party was held at the Heron Creek Botanical Gardens on the evening of March 27th, exactly as Claire had designed it. String lights threaded through 40 live oaks, white peas on every table, a string quartet playing some soft as 46 guests in cocktail attire, mingled under a sky going violet at the edges. Claire had built this evening with her own hands. She had chosen the lighting. She had tasted the salmon. She had, 3 days earlier, approved the seating chart that placed Daniel's business partners at the table nearest the small stage where the toasts would happen, at 7:40 p.m. The wedding planner's MC duties brought Claire to that same small stage, microphone in hand, exactly as planned, exactly as Reddy had requested when she'd asked Claire 2 weeks before to say something, since you basically planned my whole happiness. Daniel stood beside Renee near the front, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture Claire recognized because he had made it toward her, in this exact way, for 11 years. She looked at the microphone in her hand for 1 full second. Then she looked up. "Before I say a few words about Renee and Daniel," she began, her voice carrying clean and even across the garden through the sound system she'd rented herself, "I want to make sure everyone here has the complete story, because I think every good party deserves the truth before the toast." A few guests laughed politely, expecting a joke. It was not a joke. "My name is Claire Whitmore. I am his wife, 11 years. Rennie has known me as her oldest friend and as the woman planning this party. What she doesn't know, what almost no one in this garden knows, is that Daniel and I have been married since we were 20 years old." The band stopped. A woman near the back set down her champagne glass without drinking from it. Renee turned to look at Claire, then at Daniel, her face moving through 3 distinct stages of confusion in under 4 seconds. "Claire? What, Daniel? What's she talking about?" Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out for nearly 5 full seconds, an eternity, in front of 46 people holding drinks they had stopped raising. "I have documentation," Claire continued, calm, unhurried, exactly the voice she used when a venue's air conditioning failed 2 hours before a ceremony, showing that, over the past 14 months, 26,400 totes was transferred from our joint household account to an entity with no legitimate registration, controlled by Daniel, for what bank records describe only as consulting. I have a closing statement from Cobblestone Title and Escrow showing an $87,400 withdrawal from our retirement account 9 days ago to fund a deposit on a condominium at the Tidewater Residences, a unit Daniel told Renee he purchased to build their future together. And I have articles of organization filed with the South Carolina Secretary of State for Whitmore and Ashford Architecture, LLC, listing Renee as a 22% partner in a company seeded with $124,000. Every dollar of it from accounts that belonged equally to me. Total silence. One of the men at the table nearest the stage, a silver-haired man named Bradford Sinclair, whom Daniel had specifically invited that evening to discuss financing the new firm's first commercial contract, stood up slowly, set down his napkin, and looked at Daniel with an expression that had nothing soft left in it. "Daniel," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "is any of this true?" Daniel still hadn't answered. "Bradford, this is a private family matter. This has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with whether I'm putting capital behind a man who just spent his wife's retirement money on his girlfriend's condo," Bradford said, and picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. "Claire, you're blowing one mistake completely out of proportion," Daniel said, turning to face her fully, for the first time, his voice climbing toward the old, practiced charm that had smoothed over 1,000 smaller arguments. "We can talk about this like adults, at home, not—" "There is no one mistake in 14 months of wire transfers, Daniel." Claire said it without raising her own voice at all, which somehow landed harder than if she had shouted. "There's a pattern, and patterns don't get talked down at a cocktail hour." Daniel's project manager, a younger man named Cole Ferris, who'd worked under him for 3 years, set his drink down on the nearest table and quietly walked toward the parking lot without a word to anyone. Not dramatic. Just done, the kind of exit that told Claire he had perhaps suspected something for longer than anyone realized. A second investor at Bradford's table, a woman in a gray suit Claire didn't recognize, simply took a photo of the projected slideshow still glowing on a screen behind the stage. The firm's logo, Whitmore and Ashford architecture in clean serif type, before she too walked out. Renee was crying now, quietly, the kind of crying that comes from shock rather than grief, that would arrive later, alone. She looked at the ring on her left hand as though she had forgotten it was there. "You told me you'd never been married," she said to Daniel, her voice very small in the wide-open garden. "You told me I was the first person you'd ever wanted to build something with. Renee, I was going to tell you everything once the firm was stable, I swear to you." Daniel started. "Once the firm was stable." Renee repeated it back to him flatly, and something in her face hardened in real time. 8 years of softness, curdling into something Claire recognized from her own mirror 3 weeks earlier. "You mean once you didn't need her money anymore?" She didn't stop there. His phone was always face down. He'd take calls in the hallway. I told myself that was just how finance guys were. Renee's voice cracked on the word told, like she was hearing her own excuse out loud for the first time. She had not known. But some quiet part of her had wondered, more than once, and had chosen the version of the story that let her keep the ring on. Renee Ashford was not a villain in this story. She was a woman who had been told a true-sounding lie by someone she trusted completely, and who was now learning, in front of 46 witnesses, that her own engagement had been financed by a theft she'd had no part in choosing. She would spend the next several weeks discovering that the easiest thing in the world is to love someone honestly, and still end up standing inside someone else's fraud. One by one, in the particular hush that follows a public collapse, the guests began to leave. First Bradford, and the 2 associates he'd brought. Then Daniel's senior project manager, then's most of the rest, until the string quartet packed up their instruments without anyone asking them to. Within 20 minutes, the Heron Creek Botanical Gardens, lit beautifully for a party that no longer existed, held only 3 people. Claire, Daniel, and Renee standing 12 feet apart under string lights Claire herself had selected from a catalog 3 weeks earlier. Renee left first, walking quickly toward the parking lot without looking back, already pulling the ring from her finger. 4 days later, Renee called. Claire almost didn't answer. "I'm not calling to yell at you," Renee said, her voice flat and worn thin. "I needed to hear whether you knew about the condo and the company before that night, or if you found out the same week I did." 19 days, Claire said quietly. 8 years apart, and the first real thing you didn't tell me was the thing that mattered most, Renee said. "Not cruel, just tired. I was building a case, Renee, not keeping a secret from you." "Maybe," Renee said. "Ask me again in a year." Daniel found Claire on the gravel path near the garden's entrance. 20 minutes later, his tie loosened, his face the color of old paper. "Did you have to do it like that?" he asked. "In front of everyone? In front of Bradford?" Daniel Whitmore did not see himself, even now, as a man who had stolen anything. In his own private accounting, the one he had never once shown to an outside auditor, He had given up an Atlanta partnership worth, by his own later estimate, $40,000 a year, more than he'd ever earned in Heron Creek, specifically so Claire's business could take root in a town small enough for her to dominate it. He believed, standing on that gravel path, that a man who sacrifices a future like that has a right to build a second one somewhere else, on someone else's terms, without asking permission twice. He was wrong about who that right belonged to. He had simply never tested the idea against the woman standing across from him, long enough to find out it didn't hold. She didn't answer the way he expected. "You were supposed to call me when the Atlanta partnership offer came through 8 years ago," Claire said. "You didn't. You told me you turned it down because you wanted to." "I believed you. I put every dollar I could spare into your firm's first year instead of expanding my own company, because I believed we were building one thing together. I have spent 11 years assuming we were on the same side of every number in this marriage. The rest, Daniel, started long before that condo. I gave up more for this marriage than you've ever let yourself admit it," Daniel said, his voice rising, reaching for the old grievance like it could still hold weight. "Atlanta, the bigger firm. I stayed here for you. You stayed here for the version of this marriage where I never found out," Claire said. He had no answer for that. He never would. "My attorney will be filing for divorce this week," Claire said, "along with a claim for dissipation of marital assets. You'll be returning what's left of the retirement withdrawal and the transfers to Coastal Vista under a payment schedule Susan Kessler will draft. The firm's outside investors will be informed of the LLC filing because that's not optional once a state filing is part of a legal record." She looked at him for one more moment, not with rage, which would have felt almost easier, but with the specific, exhausted clarity of someone closing a ledger that no longer balanced. "I didn't ruin anything tonight, Daniel. I just stopped paying for what you'd already ruined." She turned and walked to her car. He did not follow. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in early May, Patricia Loomis called Claire to say she'd put in her 2 weeks' notice at Whitmore Architectural Group. Not out of fear this time, but because a competing firm in Charleston had offered her a position the moment word of the state investigation reached the local business community. South Carolina's Department of Consumer Affairs had opened a formal inquiry into Whitmore and Ashford Architecture's initial capitalization filing, after Susan Kessler's office submitted the bank records as part of the divorce proceedings. Daniel was required to produce a full accounting of the LLC's funding within 60 days or face administrative dissolution of the company. He produced it. The firm was placed under a monitored compliance period. His remaining business partners quietly withdrew, and by late June, Whitmore Architectural Group had shrunk from 9 employees to 2, Daniel, and a part-time drafter who hadn't yet found another job. Renee moved back to Lisbon in early June, taking a permanent position with the design firm she'd once only consulted for remotely. She sent Claire one email in late May, 3 sentences long, no apology requested or given, simply, "I believed him completely. I'm sorry you had to be the one to fix that. I hope you're building something good." Claire read it twice and did not reply right away. She replied 3 weeks later, 4 sentences of her own, ending with, "I hope Lisbon gives you something honest. You deserve that, even now." In August, the South Carolina Board of Architectural Examiners opened its own separate review after Bradford Sinclair, still furious about the capital he'd nearly committed, filed a formal complaint alleging Daniel had misrepresented the firm's ownership structure to prospective investors. The board's finding, issued October 3rd, didn't revoke Daniel's license outright, but it suspended his authority to serve as a principal in charge on any new commercial project for 18 months, a restriction that effectively ended his ability to run his own firm. 18 months. By November, Whitmore Architectural Group had closed its Magnolia Street office entirely, and Daniel, was working as a staff architect under another principal's license at a firm 2 towns away, signing drawings with someone else's name above his. The divorce settlement finalized in late September returned $98,200 to Claire's portion of the marital estate. The recovered transfers, a structured repayment of the retirement withdrawal, and her half of the home's equity after its sale. It was never about the money alone, and Claire would say so to anyone who asked. It was about the difference between a marriage where she had quietly absorbed 11 years of someone else's decisions and the 8 years she had already spent completely on her own, building a company that answered to no one but her. On a Saturday morning in October, 10 months after the engagement party, Claire stood in the same corner of the Heron Creek Botanical Gardens, where the string quartet had once packed up their instruments in silence, walking a different bride through her own seating chart. The peonies were gone for the season, replaced by chrysanthemums in deep amber and rust. The brass watch, the one she had once given a man who wore it on someone else's wrist, sat now in a drawer in her office, not as a wound she revisited, but as proof, when she needed it, that she had once measured a man correctly and acted on what she found. Claire never described herself, afterward, as someone who had taken revenge. She described herself, when people asked how she'd managed to stay so composed through 19 days that would have broken most people, as someone who had simply finished a job she was already good at, gathering the truth in order until it was strong enough to stand on its own in front of a room. The hardest part, she said once to Susan over coffee, wasn't exposing him. It was learning that she had spent 11 years mistaking quiet for safety. She has not made that mistake since. If you were standing in Claire's place that night, microphone in hand, 46 guests waiting, the truth fully assembled in a folder under your arm, would you have waited for a quieter room, or said it exactly where you stood? Tell me in the comments, and if this story found you, tell someone else where you found it. Subscribe for the next one.